Everyone around me thought it was normal. From the outside, my life looked calm. Steady conversations, familiar routines, quiet smiles in public. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming. If you asked anyone, they would have said, "This is just how life is." And I believed them. I told myself that the tight feeling in my chest was just stress, that the constant second-guessing was just me being thoughtful, that the exhaustion I carried, even on easy days, was something everyone felt but never talked about. In rooms full of people, I smiled at the right moments. I laughed when expected. I nodded, agreed, stayed agreeable. No one saw the part of me that was always alert, listening closely, measuring tone, watching expressions, as if one wrong word could shift the air. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, a thought would surface. Why do I feel uneasy when nothing is technically wrong? But I pushed it down, because nothing bad was happening. No shouting, no obvious cruelty, no visible scars, just subtle pauses, long silences, conversations that left me feeling smaller without knowing why. I remember standing in front of the mirror one morning, fixing my expression before leaving the house. Not my clothes, not my hair, my face, making sure it looked neutral enough, pleasant enough, safe enough. That was normal, right? At night, when the world slowed down, the weight felt heavier. My mind replayed moments that seemed harmless on the surface, but lingered deep inside. Words that sounded caring but somehow erased me. Reactions that made me doubt my memory, my feelings, my instincts. Still, I told myself I was overthinking, because everyone else seemed fine with it, because I didn't have proof, only a feeling. And feelings, I had learned, weren't always welcome. So I adapted. I stayed quiet when something bothered me. I adjusted myself instead of asking questions. I convinced myself that discomfort was just part of being close to someone. After all, if everyone thinks it's normal, who am I to say it isn't? But somewhere beneath the calm exterior, beneath the practiced smiles and quiet acceptance, a small voice kept whispering, a voice I was trying very hard not to hear. If this is normal, why does it feel like I'm slowly disappearing? And that question refused to go away. No one ever raised their voice. No doors were slammed. No obvious cruelty filled the room. And yet, every step felt dangerous. It was like walking barefoot across a floor covered in invisible glass. Nothing you could see, but everything you could feel. One wrong word, one wrong reaction, one moment of honesty, and suddenly, the air would change. I learned to watch faces more than words. A pause that lasted too long. A smile that didn't reach the eyes. Silence that felt heavier than shouting ever could. I replayed conversations in my head, again and again, searching for what I did wrong, because it always felt like it had to be me. "Are you okay?" someone once asked. I smiled automatically. "Yeah, just tired." That was easier than explaining the constant tension in my chest. Easier than admitting that even peace felt temporary, like it could shatter without warning. I didn't feel unsafe in the obvious way. I felt unsure, unsteady, like I was always bracing for impact. The smallest things became tests. A different tone, a delayed reply, a quiet room. My mind filled in the gaps with fear. Did I upset them? Did I cross a line? Should I apologize, even if I don't know why? So I softened my voice. I chose my words carefully. I swallowed opinions. I shrank myself just enough to avoid conflict. And slowly, I started calling it normal. That's the dangerous part. When emotional pressure doesn't leave bruises, you convince yourself it isn't real. You tell yourself you're sensitive, dramatic, overthinking. You ignore how your shoulders never relax, how your breath stays shallow, how your thoughts are always a step ahead. Preparing, predicting, protecting. At night, lying in the dark, I'd finally feel it. The exhaustion of pretending not to feel hurt. The weight of constantly adjusting myself to keep everything calm. My mind would whisper questions I pushed away during the day. Why do I feel guilty for needing space? Why does peace feel like something I have to earn? But morning would come, and I'd put the mask back on, because no one ever told me this was abuse. No one warned me that emotional harm can exist without cruelty, only control, silence, and fear dressed as love. I didn't know it yet, but glass, even invisible, still cuts. I didn't remember the first time I said sorry when I hadn't done anything wrong. I only remember how easily it started happening after that. Sorry for asking. Sorry for explaining. Sorry for feeling. The word slipped out before I could stop it. Like a reflex, my body learned to keep the peace. If something felt tense, I apologized. If someone sounded distant, I apologized. If I was confused, tired, or quiet, I apologized for that too. "Why are you saying sorry?" someone asked once, half laughing. I laughed too. I don't know. Habit, I guess. But it wasn't a habit. It was armor. Every apology felt like a way to make myself smaller, softer, easier to deal with. If I took the blame early, maybe the tension wouldn't grow. Maybe disappointment wouldn't turn into silence. Maybe I could avoid that familiar feeling. The one where the room suddenly felt colder, even though nothing obvious had changed. I began apologizing for existing in space, for taking time, for needing reassurance. I apologized when I spoke and when I stayed quiet. The word lost its meaning, but its weight never did. Inside, something started to shift. I stopped asking myself, how do I feel? And started asking, how will this be taken? My needs felt like inconveniences. My emotions felt excessive. Even happiness came with hesitation, like joy needed permission to exist. I learned to read the mood before expressing anything real, constantly adjusting, constantly calculating. At night, when everything was quiet, I'd replay moments in my head. Should I have apologized sooner? Did I say too much? Was I too honest? And the scariest part? I started believing the apologies, believing that I really was a problem, that harmony depended on me staying agreeable, flexible, silent when necessary. No one ever demanded I say sorry. They didn't have to. Emotional pressure doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits until you offer guilt willingly, until you take responsibility for feelings that were never yours to carry. One evening, staring at my reflection, I noticed something unfamiliar. My voice had changed, softer, less certain, like I was asking permission to be heard. That's when a quiet thought surfaced, barely loud enough to notice, but impossible to forget. When did apologizing replace speaking honestly? I didn't have the answer yet, but for the first time, I wondered if saying sorry so often wasn't kindness. It was survival. At first, it looked like love. It sounded like concern. It felt like attention. And in the beginning, it was comforting to believe that being cared for meant being corrected, adjusted, reshaped just slightly for the sake of harmony. The affection was real, but it came with quiet terms and conditions no one ever said out loud. When I agreed, things felt warm. When I adapted, things stayed calm. When I complied, love felt closer. But the moment I questioned something, when I hesitated, pushed back gently, or simply stayed silent, the air changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, just enough to notice. A pause, a sigh, a withdrawal that felt intentional but impossible to prove. "I'm just trying to help," they'd say. "I only want what's best for you." And I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that, because the alternative, that love could be dependent on behavior, felt too heavy to hold. So I adjusted myself again. I learned which opinions were welcomed and which ones created distance. I learned when to smile, when to stay neutral, when to let things go even if they hurt. Love, I realized, wasn't disappearing. It was being rationed. Praise came when I aligned. Affection came when I agreed. Warmth came when I didn't disrupt the balance. Slowly, I started editing myself before speaking, not because I was dishonest, but because honesty felt risky. It felt like something that had to be earned again and again in quiet moments. A question surfaced, one I pushed away as soon as it appeared. Would I still be loved if I stopped trying so hard? The most confusing part wasn't the absence of love. It was its presence, just inconsistent enough to keep me trying. Just enough affection to make me doubt my own discomfort. Just enough reassurance to make me question whether I was being too sensitive. I told myself this was normal, that relationships required effort, that compromise meant sacrifice. But deep down, Something felt off. Love shouldn't feel like a performance. Care shouldn't disappear when you disappoint. Affection shouldn't feel like something you earn by staying quiet. One night, lying awake, I imagined what it would feel like to be loved without conditions, without fear, without calculating every reaction. The thought felt foreign, almost unrealistic. And that's when it hit me, the most unsettling realization yet. If love only exists when you shrink yourself, is it really love at all? I didn't have the courage to answer that question yet, but it stayed with me, growing heavier with every moment I tried to be enough. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment where I could say, this is when I disappeared. It happened quietly, between conversations, compromises, and the constant effort to stay acceptable. One day, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I spoke without rehearsing first. Every sentence passed through an invisible filter. Is this too much? Will this upset them? Should I say it differently? My thoughts were no longer mine alone. They were shaped by anticipation, by fear, by the need to keep everything steady. I stopped noticing my own preferences. What I liked to watch. What music felt like home. What opinions used to excite me. Those parts didn't vanish. They just stopped being consulted. When someone asked, "What do you want?" my mind went blank. Not because I didn't care, but because wanting something felt dangerous. Wanting meant risking disappointment. Wanting meant stepping outside the version of myself that kept things calm. So I became adaptable, agreeable, easy. On the outside, nothing looked wrong. I showed up. I smiled at the right moments. I laughed when expected. People said I seemed mature, understanding, patient. Inside, something felt hollow. I started measuring my worth by how little space I took up, by how smoothly I blended into other people's expectations, by how rarely I caused discomfort. The less visible I became, the safer things felt, or so I told myself. At night, alone with my thoughts, there was a strange sense of grief, not loud or dramatic, just a quiet sadness I couldn't name, like missing someone I used to know but couldn't quite remember anymore. Who was I before all this adjusting? What did I sound like when I wasn't careful? Sometimes I catch glimpses, an opinion rising to the surface, a feeling demanding attention, but I'd push them back down. Old habits had taught me that staying silent was easier than explaining myself. Losing yourself doesn't always feel like pain. Sometimes it feels like relief. Relief from conflict. Relief from tension. Relief from having to be fully seen. But relief has a cost, because the more I disappeared, the harder it became to feel real, to feel grounded, to feel alive in my own life. One evening, staring at my reflection, I noticed something unsettling. My eyes looked familiar, but distant, like I was watching myself from the outside. And for the first time, a frightening thought settled in. I wasn't just changing to survive. I was slowly forgetting who I was meant to be. I didn't know how to find myself again yet, but I knew this much. If I kept shrinking, there might be nothing left to return to. At some point, I stopped questioning what was happening around me and started questioning myself instead. If something felt wrong, I assumed I was overreacting. If a comment stung, I told myself I was too sensitive. If the silence felt heavy, I convinced myself I had earned it. Blame became internal, automatic, familiar. I replayed conversations late at night, searching for mistakes only I could see. A tone that was off. A word I shouldn't have used. A feeling I should have kept hidden. It felt safer to believe I was flawed than to consider that something else might be broken. Maybe I just need to try harder. I thought. Be more patient. More understanding. Less me. That belief settled deep. So deep it started shaping how I saw myself. I became my own harshest critic, correcting thoughts before they fully formed, doubting instincts that once felt natural, apologizing internally even when no one was around. My inner voice stopped asking questions and started issuing judgments. You're difficult. You expect too much. This is your fault. The strange part was how logical it all sounded. Blaming myself gave the chaos a reason. It made pain feel manageable. If I was the problem, then fixing myself could fix everything. So I worked on shrinking my needs. lowering my expectations, explaining away discomfort before it had time to speak. From the outside, it looked like growth, like maturity, like emotional intelligence. Inside, it felt like erosion. There were moments, small, quiet ones, when doubt crept in, when a thought whispered, "What if you're not the problem?" But I dismissed it quickly. That idea felt dangerous, unstable. It threatened the fragile order I'd built by blaming myself. One night, sitting alone in the dark, I felt something crack. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to notice. I realized how tired I was. Tired of fixing things that kept breaking. Tired of carrying responsibility that didn't belong to me. I looked back at the person I used to be, the one who trusted their feelings, who didn't second-guess every reaction, and felt an unexpected wave of compassion. Not blame, compassion. And for the first time in a long while, a new thought surfaced. Softer, braver. What if this pain isn't proof that I'm broken? What if it's proof that something isn't right? I didn't have answers yet, but that question changed the direction of my thoughts. Because sometimes, healing doesn't begin by fixing yourself. It begins by realizing you were never the thing that needed fixing. For years, it felt like isolated moments, small flashes of tension, silence, or subtle disapproval. Each one could be explained away. Each one felt temporary. Each one seemed like something I had imagined. But slowly, the moments began to connect. A pause here, a withdrawn glance there, words that cut softly but lingered like smoke, a compliment offered, then quietly withdrawn. Patterns began to emerge. Not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable once noticed. I started keeping track in my mind, like a silent detective tracing invisible lines. And with every memory I revisited, the truth became harder to ignore. The discomfort wasn't random. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't my fault. It was intentional, not in the obvious, aggressive sense. There were no shouts, no threats, just control hidden in expectation, withdrawal disguised as concern, love that was conditional and strategically timed. Every small interaction seemed innocent in isolation, but together they formed a map of manipulation. The realization was dizzying. I remembered the apologies that came automatically, the times I shrank myself to avoid conflict, the constant rehearsal before speaking, the careful measurement of my reactions. And suddenly it all made sense. These weren't quirks. They weren't misunderstandings. They were patterns of emotional control, subtle, consistent, and pervasive. It was like seeing the invisible glass I'd been walking on for years. The recognition was both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it confirmed what I'd feared. The person I trusted most had been shaping my world without my consent. Liberating because naming it made it tangible, real, and real things can be addressed. Real things can be changed. For the first time, I didn't feel entirely trapped. I began to chart the ways I'd been giving away my voice, my confidence, my sense of self. And for the first time, I considered reclaiming it. Small thoughts at first. What if I don't apologize this time? What if I speak my mind? What if I honor my own feelings? But even as the thoughts grew stronger, fear lingered. Fear of confrontation. Fear of rejection. Fear of losing even the conditional affection that had kept me tethered. And yet, I knew something important. Patterns exist to be recognized. Invisible chains exist to be broken. And even when the steps feel small, noticing is the first act of courage. Because sometimes the first victory isn't escaping. They're realizing you've been confined all along. And in that realization, I felt the faintest spark of something I hadn't felt in years. Possibility. For years, my instincts have been quieted. My feelings have been edited, filtered, even erased, sometimes without my noticing. But now, after recognizing pattern, I felt a stir deep inside, a whisper asking me to finally choose myself. At first, it felt wrong. I tried speaking up and noticed how my voice trembled, how my chest tightened, how the words felt foreign on my tongue. Every act of self-respect, every small boundary I set, came with guilt. It was as if choosing me automatically meant betraying someone else, someone I had been taught to please without question. I'm just trying to be fair, I told myself. But even as I said it, my mind knew the truth. Fairness wasn't the issue. Survival had been. For years, I had survived by minimizing myself, by shrinking, by adjusting to avoid disruption. Now, choosing myself felt like stepping into uncharted territory. The first time I said no without apology, my heart raced. My thoughts screamed at me, "You're selfish. You're ungrateful. You're wrong." Yet beneath that panic, a different feeling emerged. Light, fragile, yet undeniable relief. For the first time in a long time, my body didn't tense under invisible pressure. My chest wasn't tight. My mind, though cautious, felt alert in a different way. Awake, clear, awake enough to feel that maybe survival didn't have to mean erasure. But choosing yourself is rarely dramatic. It's subtle, quiet, almost imperceptible to the outside world. No one noticed the small victories. Saying what I wanted, admitting when I felt hurt, taking a walk alone without asking permission, letting myself feel frustrated without apologizing. And yet, each small act felt monumental inside. Each one chipped away at the fear that had kept me compliant for so long. Each one reminded me that I didn't have to shrink to belong. That love and respect aren't conditional on silence or invisibility. Still, fear lingered like a shadow. Will this backfire? Will I be rejected? Am I doing something wrong? I let the fear exist without letting it control me. Because choosing yourself doesn't feel comfortable at first. It doesn't feel safe. It feels wrong. Until you realize it's the only right thing you've ever done for yourself. And that realization, quiet as it is, begins to free you. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was beginning to live. Healing didn't arrive with a dramatic revelation. There was no sudden confrontation, no grand escape. It came quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the spaces I had once ignored. The mornings were the first to change. Waking up no longer felt like stepping into a battlefield of expectations. My breath was steadier. My thoughts, though still cautious, were my own. I noticed the little details. The sunlight hitting the floor, the hum of a distant car, the rhythm of my own heartbeat, and felt them without judgment, without fear. I began to reclaim what had been mine all along, my voice, my opinions, my space. Saying what I wanted no longer felt like rebellion. It felt like honesty. Setting boundaries didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like respect for myself, for my feelings, for the life I was quietly building. The world outside didn't always change. The people who had conditioned me, consciously or unconsciously, didn't all shift overnight. Some remained distant, some still withdrew, and yet it no longer broke me. Because I had learned something more profound than approval or affection. I could exist fully, even when the world didn't conform to my needs. Healing was in the quiet victories. The first time I laughed without measuring the sound. The first time I cried without guilt. The first time I said no and felt no tremor of fear. These moments were small, almost invisible, but they carried weight heavier than anything I had endured before. I learned that resilience doesn't roar. It whispers. It grows in subtle ways, often unseen, in the spaces we thought were empty. It is measured not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in mornings when you get out of bed, knowing you belong to yourself. I began to recognize my own worth, not because anyone validated it, but because I finally remembered who I was before the chains of silent control had tightened around me. Each choice to honor my feelings, each small act of self-respect, built a quiet fortress inside me, a place where I could breathe, think, and live without shrinking. And in that quiet, something remarkable happened. I realized I was never broken. I was never too much. I had only been surviving in the shadows of someone else's rules. Now, I was stepping into the light of my own life. I didn't need loud declarations or visible victories. Healing didn't demand applause or recognition. It simply required me to be present, to be honest, to choose myself again and again. For the first time, I could say with certainty, I am here, I belong, and I am enough. And in that stillness, for the first time in years, I felt free.